Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us, and we are on a new platform. We are experimenting, and last week we were on, I can't recall the name of the platform, but it didn't work out. We weren't all that happy with it, so we just want to forget it. But anyway, we are on Riverside FM this week. We have been exploring possibilities beyond the world of Zoom, and this one seems to be working pretty well. Anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley, and if you're new to the Theology Pugcast, I'm one of the hosts. I'm a pastor. I serve a church here in the Pacific Northwest, and I've written a number of different things. And one of those things is a book that's forthcoming on Tom Bombadil, and I just got word that Brad Bierzer is moving ahead with the foreword to the book. He stated to the editors that he loved my book. He didn't say that to me directly, but I heard it through the grapevine. So that's a good sign. But anyway, we're breathlessly anticipating the release of that book. But enough of that for now. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves, and why don't we go to you first, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I run a ministry called Every Square Inch Ministries.
Great. Now, Tom, as soon as you're done, I'm going to come back in with a couple of announcements, but then we'll cut back to you because you are the man of the day.
All right. Tom Price, teach systematic theology and Christian ethics, philosophy, a few other things. One place, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And I am in the process of writing things. I hope to have good announcements with all of that. A lot of material that had sat in stacks and back burners and small notes and clips, finally starting to actually come back alive. So I'm excited about that.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So before you jump into the topic of the day, Tom, we want to let folks out in Pugcast land know, we want the Pugsters, we want the Grumblers to know that things are coming together for a couple of live events. One of those events is the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. The Fight, Laugh, Feast Network conference in Nashville, which is actually, I guess, in Lebanon, but I think they're just saying Nashville just because everybody knows what Nashville is. But we are going to be live on stage at the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference. We're very honored to be, asked to do this, and so we've confirmed the dates. We are free. We're going to definitely be there, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So we don't know exactly what we're going to talk about yet, but that's not unusual. Every week we talk about what are we going to talk about this time?
Up into the moment.
That's right. And another thing is we've been hinting at a Pacific Northwest tour for a little while now, and things are coming together for that, and we have some dates. So it's going to happen. We're going to be in the Pacific Northwest from October 28th through November 3rd, and we're going to be in the Portland area on the 29th, 30th, and 31st. We're going to be up in Moscow, Idaho, on the 31st and 1st of November, and we're going to be in the Seattle, Washington area, the 2nd and 3rd. We're hitting all the big towns.
It's almost like we have a comedy show going. Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, all three of those locations are infested with progressives. But hey, we're from New England. We're used to that. We're used to being the kind of the weird, socially conservative intellectuals and the only guys in the room who actually believe in reality. But anyway, such is our lives coming up in the months of October and November, and we're looking forward to that. But anyway, enough of that. You'll hear more about that in days to come, and we'll give you all the specifics. But you've got a few months to plan. And we do too. Okay, Tom, what are we talking about today?
Okay, well, what I decided to talk about, I kind of threw something out to you, I think a couple days ago, which I think is going to actually tend to be a series of things now that I look at how big a topic it is and how I will not be able to do the kind of justice I want to. But in short, what I want to do is kind of look at something we've touched on at different points, but is really a comprehensive subject, I think, that is important for us to address with more depth. And I think it's the issue of meaning and history, or what, some people in academic world will talk about as kind of philosophy of history, or speculative history. But what is meant by that is not simply the science of doing history, although that's part of it. But it's actually the question of sort of a metaphysics of history. What is history? What's its nature? What's its purpose? Does it have a telos? Does it have an end, an ultimate frame of meaning from which doing history makes sense, learning from history makes sense, being I think cultivated and shaped by certain aspects of history makes sense. And I think the reason this topic keeps coming up for me is I keep seeing a cloud of uncertainty around the contemporary culture and even the church, both with historical ignorance, but also an inability to discern, first of all, the significance or importance of history, other than just kind of in a kind of symbolic way that addresses certain kinds of positions within contemporary, politics of power. And so I think Glenn had posted some things in different formats this week. One of the articles, I don't know if he remembers posting, is on Obama and the broken nation. He has come of age. But there's a great aspect in this where it talks about kind of the aging elderly notion of kind of outmoded and historically tried ideas that failed. And the way they get repackaged with all this energy, almost in a kind of advertising and propaganda campaign. But combined with that is this need to basically take advantage of adolescent ignorance of history and experience. They become kind of the fool tools, if you will, that knock everything down to allow a certain energy to fill these otherwise very bad ideas, which history has shown over and over again, not only not only haven't worked and caused so much dread and despair, but can't work. That was
I think some of us, when we think about this, like I think of myself as seeing a rerun. This is like the third or fourth time in my life I've seen this rerun. And I was born in the 60s. I lived up right next to college campuses. We had hippies who lived with us, as a kid. This is stuff that's old news for me. I think that, what we have sort of like this, we've got, I guess progressives who take advantage of sort of new virgin soil, so who are the patsies this time? You know what I'm getting at? So if I actually think, and this is something that disturbs me a little bit, I actually think that some homeschool kids are the new generation of patsies because they've grown up in sort of worlds that were constructed in such a way so as to sort of keep out a lot of this stuff, and the stuff is never addressed consequently. It's just alien. It's it's sort of like that's what other people do, and then, but at the same time, there's a fascination with it that they have, and then they kind of get sucked in, and the old methods for sort of debunking traditional values are dredged up once again and applied to this group.
And the thing is, all the bad ideas that they keep wanting to try again were originally constructed by dead white males. Mm-hmm. You notice that?
Yeah, I noticed that most of the progressives are live white males.
They tend to feed it.
So, Tom, I used to introduce my my survey classes with concepts of philosophy of history.
Yeah.
And the three I tended to use were first Ambrose Bierce. History is an account, mostly false, of events mostly unimportant, performed by rulers, mostly knaves, or soldiers, mostly fools.
Wasn't he the author of the Devil's Dictionary?
That's where that comes from. Then you have Henry Ford, History is Bunk. And Mark Twain, History is just one damn thing after another. But the problem is these damn things keep coming back.
Yeah. Well, that I think is an interesting point. Chris, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is important to keep in mind is when an historian does the work of history, there is a selection process. And that's important to note. Now, the selection process in terms of what do we record, why is it important, these kinds of things, is not arbitrary. I think a cynical view is, the winners, write the history, and that it's just all kind of self-justifying. I think that's belied by the facts, because a lot of history has been written by the losing side, and a lot of history that survived was very critical of the regimes that were in power at the time. But this whole idea that we need to have criteria that we use to evaluate things is just true in every walk of life. And you just think about the fact if you were to tell your wife, this is what happened on my way home from work today, you wouldn't describe every single car that passed you. You wouldn't describe the entire journey and every street that you traveled down. You would be selective. You would select material based on how well it helps to get across a point. All those things that you're relaying are facts. And yes, you were sort of in the story, and you were, providing a perspective. So in some sense, it's not fully objective, as though,
It's interesting you mentioned that, because my late doctor father, John Webster, I was talking to him. We were talking about different conceptions of kind of inspiration and inerrancy. And he held wholeheartedly to inerrancy. But he said, but what I don't mean by that is that when Scripture says, Jesus and the disciples went straight to Jerusalem, that didn't mean that maybe they stopped and went to the bathroom on the way. In other words, you're not being less historical just because you don't mention every single else. And to hyper literalize that kind of statement is not really it's not objective in any kind of human sense of the word, if you could say that. It's not after every kind of aspect, but that's one trail. And I want to get back to this notion that there are measures in some sense to kind of qualify history when at least you're aiming towards an account of the reality that occurred, but also the notion that you're trying to, in some sense, make sense of its meaning. And then what kind of reality vision is there to say history both can the process of gathering facts and evaluating them can be something that we can do in a way that actually does achieve some sense of the meaning and significance of things and address real happenings and their consequence. And again, there is a kind of finitude we have in relationship to that, I think, which accounts for a lot of the conflicts in interpretation and power conflicts. But on the other hand, I think the fact that we try to measure an account of reality and have some kind of meaningful narrative that tie together different aspects is already hinting towards something I think that Christianity introduced to the world in a much more fuller way than maybe classic ancient views of what the historical was considered to be. And then we see with the modern enlightened world and postmodernity, I think they take a hold of a lot of Christian concepts that don't belong really to anything from their reality or non-reality visions, and then they act as though this is natural and normal and something that you just have believed anyway, whether Christianity was on the scene or not. Henri de Lubeck had this great quote, and I think maybe it's worth kind of starting here. Is he said, Christianity is not one of the great things of history. History is actually one of the great things of Christianity.
Ooh, I like
that. And I think that quote is brilliant in the sense that history as we know it, kind of linear events that really occur in time, space, not as mere constructs, but actual realities in the world, and that have consequence, but also tied to a larger order of meaning that is hinted at in all of the events of history, but is not merely located there. The revelatory or the ultimate ground and end of history is actually the source that will unfold the depths of that meaning. And so, in a sense, Christ is, the Alpha and the Omega. Christ is the center point that for Christians, the pivot of all meaning in history comes to its culmination. And his taking on flesh and dwelling among us is the entrance, in some sense, of the revelation of that meaning, that it was only hinted at in shadows and hints even in the Old Testament, although they were there. But what you have entered into time is actually something of the ultimate meaning of history, the end, but only a taste of it. And it's actually, if you read later in Revelation, it's not up until some major apocalyptic and end time events, really, that you're going to see Jesus undo the scroll where the meaning of history is finally let out, right?
I think there are a couple of things here I just want to take quick note of, Tom, because this is great stuff. You can kind of think about Christianity and history at a couple of levels. One is just just kind of the history of history. This idea that Christianity provides the framework within which history can actually be done as a discipline, because of the point you just made. Beginning and linear. That framework provides the background against which, to mix my metaphors there, history is written. And it reminds me of that great quote or that great sort of witticism, and I can't remember who said it, but whoever said it was referring to Jean-Paul Sartre. He said, Jean-Paul Sartre is the greatest atheist Christianity ever produced. In other words, it's within the framework of the Christian of a Christian civilization that our modern atheists do their thing. And they steal from us all the time. I made a point of bringing this out in my book, Household and Warfare Cosmos, with regard to Carl Sagan. But the other thing is that there is a real meaning. There is a real meaning that Christianity is the means by which that meaning is revealed. In other words, Christ, as you noted, the incarnate God. It's because of his entrance into history that history has meaning to begin with. Not just in the sense of that there's a transcendent God who begins and ends things, but entering in. So really good stuff.
That's right, and I think that the incarnation really is a significant game changer in terms of the conceptual frame that the church went into the utmost parts of the world. I mean, you see, Philo of Alexandria, for example. He's wrestling with intermediaries. He's wrestling with balancing the Hellenic cyclical view with the the Jewish view, and he was trying to make a way to kind of bring these two into some kind of harmony, but his emphasis tended to be a bit more on these kind of like his logos was definitely not the eternal God, for example. And so this was something kind of shy of that, which our heresies would tend to pick up on. But by the time you get to the New Testament, you actually have this radically new yet something foretold all along come on the scene. You have something interesting happen, even with. I mean, think of the Old Testament. I really think the roots of the Christian vision of history is the Old Testament. Its understanding of the historical and the significance of that. These events that are happening are not random. They aren't merely defined only by that immediate context that they're happening, but they're tied to a larger plot line, if you will. And our theologians tend to use redemptive history or something along these lines. But what we're talking about basically is history in which divine action is the primary center and cause of what's going on with all these secondary causes. So there is a place for secondary causes to be doing their thing and only look at it from that level. In other words, what do I mean by that? For example, if somebody they're building a tower in Babylon, on the level of creaturely causes, you can just look at the creaturely elements of that. But that doesn't tell you what the story of the Tower of Babel, seen from the revelatory light of it's trying to make a ladder to the heavens, and what that's all about is all about. So these two things they're happening, but just on different orders of reality. So I think one of the key things here is the historical and the providential are two aspects of a Christian view of things that ties together the eternal and the temporal in a way that I don't think the cyclical views of the pagan world, if you will, was able to do. And so they tended to think either of an eternal recurrence, which Nietzsche wanted to get back to, or a certain timelessness where you would just have kind of eternity just keep showing up over and over again in time. And there really was no significance to things other than being vehicles for the eternal. And so I think Christianity, the Old Testament, go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important here is to get that idea of linear time, which you've been discussing here, because I've said before multiple times that modern critical theory, critical race theory, and all of that is a Christian heresy. Yeah. Because what it does is it takes the Christian emphasis on the rights of the poor and the oppressed, and it absolutizes them, but in a way that removes it from the theological frame.
Yeah.
What you see with the idea of Hegel, where history is moving toward a conclusion, Marx, where it is moving toward a conclusion, the entire rhetoric of being on the right side of history, all of that is yet another version of a Christian heresy. Yeah, because it is through Judaism and Christianity that we get the idea that history is moving in a direction, but they're putting it in the immanent frame rather than in the transcendental.
Yeah, excellent. And so one of the things I was originally going to do is talk about emancipatory conceptions of history like Hegel and Marx, and then show how basically they are just that, an immanentizing of something that was held within a proper view of transcendence and immanence in classic Christianity, and then the way in which a lot of the bad outflow of doing that is really what we're dealing with today. But what they are is they hijack something, they unmoor something from the Christian metaphysical vision as Scripture and classical Christianity represented it, but it has enough of that in it. For example, and we'll get to this, I'm going to do this on another week, but Hegel does have a teleology. History has a meaning. It's the absolute through creatures, human creatures, realizing itself. When you start to mesh God and creation so close together, and the action of a human is basically the actualization of the eternal, you start to see how politics takes on the dimension it does, because that is the absolute realizing itself in time. And therefore, there's a necessity to it, which creates a worldview of violence. But that's something I want to get to later. But you hit on it exactly the way I want to start taking it, is kind of showing first what revolution did Christianity introduce into the world, and then what is the character kind of that classic Christian vision, and then what happens when we immanentize this and uproot it from its proper Christian metaphysic and enter it into a speculative one like Hegel, Marx, Herder, Kant, and some of the stuff today. So that's kind of what this kind of series I want to do. So we can draw off of all these figures, but I definitely want to do better justice to them as well.
Well, I think before you jump into that, Tom, I want to just briefly explore the idea that history is a story, and cyclical stories, because they don't go anywhere, don't make good stories. There is a kind of, I think, sort of critique of the kind of the cyclical that is narrative in nature. In other words, the structure of meaning just generally requires that there's a beginning, middle, and an end, right? So for people who enjoyed, J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, there are a lot of writers who've written fantasy, and one of those guys is a fellow named Robert Jordan, who wrote something called The Wheel of Time. Yeah, and The Wheel of Time, if you've read it, that he's endeavoring to sort of write a fantasy, create a kind of a universe in which a cyclical, sort of a history is at work, and time is not going anywhere. And Jordan died before he could finish it, but there's really no place it was going anyway. After about the third or fourth book, I was like, "This is going nowhere," and that was the point. It just doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. I know Ronald Nash. Ronald Nash. You probably remember him from years ago, kind of Reformed philosopher. But he used to talk about he called it, the pessimistic view of the cyclical view of time. But here's an interesting point here, and maybe one of you knows better how to sum up kind of cyclical views than kind of how I've summed it. But there is this notion that first of all, the historical doesn't take on that kind of meaning significance for cyclical views of time. Rather, the way maybe taking, you think of maybe the old statues in ancient Greece, the way in which they sort of timelessness could be captured in the making of an ideal image within a particular statue. That was sort of how they would view time. Of course, they still had to live in time, and so they did see a kind of pattern to the cycle of the work week, the agricultural, cycle. And so, in a way, Christianity, I don't want to kind of communicate that Christianity doesn't have some aspects of its very thick understanding of history that doesn't include that. Genesis is the setting up of time, the ordering of days, the evening and morning, the first day, the way in which the whole work week is set up. Rest, Sabbath, limiting that. But then that sets the pattern for, of course, agricultural cycle and the like. So we do have something of a pattern. And we just said a little while ago that this is the third or fourth time around we've seen this stuff. So on the level of secondary human creaturely levels, there are kind of patterns that kind of keep showing up. You could talk some kind of patterns of rebellion on the one hand, the natural consequences of certain ideas within the confines of finite reality. Certain ideas are going to be enacted in reality where that reality is going to be impacted by it. And when that is done, that shows a certain set of results that will show up again and again. But that's something very different than what we mean by linear time. We're talking about the way is that all that repetition is not something that is just the reenactment over and over again of the same thing, but it is actually different. So we can affirm a little bit of Herder there, but it's also going somewhere. And it is not simply the reduplication, but it is the unfolding of something that will come to a culmination.
Yeah, Tom, maybe one way to think about cyclical time is to think about it through the lens of Plato. Mm-hmm. Plato believes that there is a thing he called the One, which he can identify with God, that is the source of all things. Everything is sort of an overflow, an emanation out of him, and it trickles down through all kinds of different layers until it eventually ends up with the world. Now, the One is completely unchanging and unchangeable. It just is what it is. And what that means is that time can't go anywhere because everything that happens is simply a reflection of the static, unchanging, impersonal One that is at the origin of everything. Anything that happens in this world is simply an expression of that. But since that's unchanging, it's not going anywhere. History can't go places, and you're just stuck in this constant recurrence.
Yeah, it makes me wonder a little bit about various eschatologies. When we think about amillennial understandings of the nature of history. I wonder sometimes, and this is probably unfair, but I wonder sometimes if a little Neoplatonism is behind some of the ways of thinking that we associate with the amillennial view. I'm not saying in every case, but I wonder about whether or not it is present.
Not so much among the amillennials I know, but we may know a different set.
But I'm sure it. I think it does impact. It has impacted Christianity, Christianity brought its view, but it brought it into a very different set of understandings. that it hasn't fully and always weaned itself off of. I've read some people where the theologians are saying it really wasn't up to 19th century. It was some of the stuff that was, I think it was actually Rowan Williams on something studying the past, that a Christian conception of time really didn't take root in certain arenas for, almost 1900 years. So it finally was able to come to full fruition. I have to kind of trace that back down. But I think, what was set in seed, if you will, is still something we're continuously kind of unpacking as things change. But it's amazing how, and I think this is one of the things that I think it was Hans Frey. Didn't he write what was his work on?
Let me look
something about
here.
Biblical and historical narrative. I can't remember the name of the book. But anyway, it was having to do with the way in which basically historical narrative, if we've come to understand it in the West, is completely indebted to the biblical understanding of history and linear history. And that even, the way in which people tell their stories in the West and everything else is not something that would have ever occurred had Christianity not come on the scene. And I think this is very similar, I think, to Glenn's point with these the radical movements that try to kind of think that Christianity somehow is this grand oppressive meta narrative that has done nothing except oppress and has offered nothing else, and yet they hold that view of time and in a kind of reductive form and culmination that some kind of justice can and will be achieved. I mean, think of the think of the ancient world. I mean, you're really in a position in which justice can never be achieved. If there, and some of the figures, I think it was the Stoics, who basically, this is just going to be keep being done over and over again. I think Nietzsche, interesting. I didn't realize this. It's something I read a long time ago, and it came back to mind. Nietzsche's way of grappling with his saying, okay, he wants to return to the myth of the eternal return. His way of grappling with it to make it meaningful, if you will, is that you need to act in such a way that if this is what you're going to eternally have to do, it's worth doing.
Right.
So every single moment bears the burden of that kind of eternal pressure, if you will, to make sure that your eternal reduplication of it is such that you would want to have to do that over and over and over and over again, nonstop, forever. Sisyphean, carrying the boulder up the hill.
Right.
And
I can't imagine
again,
wanting to do. I can't imagine how that would ever be, feasible. That this is something I could do forever. I mean, even like eating chocolate. I mean, it's like sooner or later you're just like, that's enough. I mean, I just said enough.
Well, but Chris, all you have to do is go to any contemporary service, and you find lots of people who can sing of your love forever.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, my patience with that is very short.
Yeah, my dad had a say. Go ahead, Glenn.
My daughter, by the way, pointed out, I can sing of your love forever is 7 words.
My dad always had this thing where he said, if heaven is what the Baptists keep saying it is, I don't see anything appealing about it. But his point was this kind of endless repetition of really things that he wouldn't typically want to spend any of his time doing other than a little while during the week, I understand that's how banal worship had tended to become at a certain point. But I think, one of the points here is, it's something that's worth mentioning is Nietzsche at least was what I consider to be consistent enough to follow through. Whether that means anything in his world or not doesn't matter. But he followed through that if God is dead, in any mean, the transcendence gone. If basically the earth has been unmoored from the sun, if you will, then certain things have to follow. I don't think social justice warriors that have bought that ontology ripped from the Christian redemptive vision really thought through enough that the real consequence of their thinking once it leaves that is a very brutal thing, which Nietzsche was able to see. a very vindictive kind of dealing with injustices, and a very oppressive one. But on the other hand, where do they go other than an absolute materialism, which is you've spent your whole life pursuing nothing, or a Nietzschean kind of eternal recurrence. If this is what you want to spend all of your life doing, only focusing on this one aspect of things, that this is what's going to be repeated for you forever. And I don't see actually culture being developed out of that.
No,
I mean, I think that was Nietzsche's aim, is to at least rebirth the higher aspects of our natures, if you will. I think that's what he wanted. I don't think that's what I'm seeing.
Well, the problem, of course, with Nietzsche is that if you don't have any transcendence, you don't have any standard against which to rate things as being more important than other things or higher than other things. It's just
that's right.
Whatever. And this is why justice eventually falls apart. Within the world of the woke, the only reason why their agenda has any salience, has any sort of future, is because there are still some people who are kind of operating by the old standards. So if you lose those, and we've talked about this before, what if the patriarchy decides, well, what they refer to as the patriarchy. Okay, yeah, that's the way it all works. You're right. It's just whoever's strongest wins. Okay, we're just going to play by those rules now. Let's go for it. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the whole way of categorizing that they take for granted, oppressed and oppressor, just doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just a free for all.
Yes, that's right. Well, see, Nietzsche agreed with you. He did not buy this notion that he thought it was a Christian hangover that the slave revolt, that you could use guilt to somehow shame the oppressor into becoming an ally. He thought that was, if anything, that was kind of something that disgusted him. And on the other end, now an interesting point is, I guess, kind of tied to this is kind of the way in which we see now, and again, I'm going to kind of go back and forth with these things, but the way we see this history has to now be, first of all, reinterpreted from a certain set of present ideals, aims, goals. And so anything in the past that did not somehow accord with that, or anything guilty of that we've seen this going on for generations, is somehow to be shamed, blacklisted, burned, scorned, not taught, not understood. And the only thing that can be is this kind of places where this pure set of ideals and this reinterpreted history can kind of take hold, coupled with this kind of absolute downgrading of the past, this kind of unrootedness.
Well, and you also have to limit your study of history to contemporary villains.
Yeah.
So, for example, you never discuss the fact of slavery in Africa. You never discuss the Arab slave trade to sub-Saharan Africa and the horrendous levels of brutality that were involved in that. You never discuss the fact that Native Americans held slaves, or that the Aztecs slaughtered tens of thousands of people,
right?
Kind of on a regular basis. Those are things that you don't have to address, you don't have to talk about. You look at the past only through the lens of contemporary offenses.
And then what you also do is you have basically what I would call I'm playing the game now, that I would call basically systemic, ethnocentric, if you will, supremacy, imperialistically conceived. Let me unpack that. You happen to be a person that is in one of the dominant societies, even if you're not one of the majority within it. And so you have all the privileges and advantages to basically that no one else who's working in sweatshops in the rest of the world and actually putting together the parts that make up your iPhone while you tweet each other about injustice in your own country are about. So you see very little concern for real global oppression, where it is happening in ways where people don't live in rough part of towns, but still have a flat screen TV the size of their living room. And you're not addressing the horrendous oppressions in the world in conditions that people do. So what you have is, yes, relative injustices are injustices. Relative oppressions are oppressions. And this is not to minimize the suffering and hurt of people. But what it's to say is, when we only take conceptions of oppression and injustice, which happen to be relative within a frame of probably everyone that's been more privileged than anyone in the history of the whole world, and are only dealing with it within that small micro level, there's something fundamentally problematic about that. See, Christianity, when it's doing its thing right, hasn't been guilty of that. It has actually been part of mission work in all of the world, going into living amongst the conditions of the oppressed, and actually bringing good news, and actually bringing the very heart message that uproots the idolatry at the core of things, that actually starts to change places from darkness to light. And this is something you just can't get. You can't get with these pseudo breakoffs of pseudo Christian ideals.
Let me introduce a great resource. Glenn noted a number of historical facts that probably folks have not been introduced to related to slavery. Probably the best treatment of slavery I've ever read was by Orlando Patterson. And Orlando Patterson, he's I think a social critic and historian who taught at Harvard. I think he may still be there. But he's from the Caribbean. He's from Jamaica, so he's descendant of slaves in Jamaica. But he wrote a book entitled Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, which was a marvelous book that I read maybe 20 plus years ago. And it was one of those seminal books for me. But he starts the book off with his confession. And his confession was, when I began my study, I assumed that Western culture erroneously was the great, the great source of injustice in the world, and that Western culture was uniquely guilty of certain things, and one of those things was slavery. And he said, what I discovered is the exact opposite. Western culture is the source of our commitment to freedom, and it's the history of the world universally in which we see slavery practiced. He takes you through, just the way Glenn does or did, continent by continent. This is what slavery looked like in South America. This is what slavery looked like in North America amongst Native Americans, as Glenn noted. This is what slavery looked like in Africa. This is what slavery looked like in the South Pacific. And he says, some of those ways that slavery was practiced was a lot worse than anything we've seen, in recent history. So, a great book. If people want a resource that will introduce them to just how the Christian faith, and he makes the connection to Christianity, how the Christian faith has helped to transform the world for the better with regard to the elevation of freedom to the level that we now, recognize in terms of its importance. That's the book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture by Orlando Patterson.
And that's the other thing. I mean, this goes right back to Christian conception of history and its meaning, is that we can actually talk about the fact from a perspective in which what was a norm in most of the world almost universally, and was a repetitious cycle, was actually broken when you have, not broken everywhere all at once. See, this is the other thing, and this troubles me with, I think, a lot of the current presentist thinking, is that there's this technological, everything has to happen all at once, rather than the biblical understanding that great actions take time. This is, look at the incarnation. Look at the years of wailing and wanting and hastening and waiting that goes on with the whole history of the Bible. Look at when the fullness of time fully comes. Look at the kind of the way in which it took the church 200 to 300 years to hammer out all the nuances of what biblical teaching said about the incarnation and the Trinity, right? So great action takes time. Christianity didn't just end every sort of social and structural form in which sin arranged itself, but what it did is introduce the uprooting of it. It took the pathogen out. it took out that which was cancerous, so that the rest could start to heal in an imperfect way until the fullness of time comes in the full way. And so what you have is a very impatient, obnoxious eschatological thinking, if you will, that, everything has to be realized right now. If we don't have absolute perfect justice, perfect systems of government, and what they don't realize is when they try to do that, not only undercutting reality like Christian history basically attests to, they end up doing the worst kind of damage, because they try to bring the kingdom out of their own resources, and their own resources are not just. They are not righteous. They are not holy, and they are not pure. This is why the kingdom, when it comes in its fullness, is Christ coming.
Yeah, the entire rejection of the concept of historical processes is really at the root of a lot of this, as you just pointed out.
Yeah.
And where it leads, if you try to force it, where it leads is automatically totalitarianism.
Yes.
There's really no other alternative. You either let the processes play out, you allow historical change to occur at the pace that the society can handle it, or you impose it from above in a totalitarian way. And, those are really your only two choices. What I'm looking at right now is, if you look at the statistics on race relations in the U.S., up until really not too long ago, African Americans were saying, on the whole, race relations are really pretty good. And then suddenly you get this big push surrounding George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and so on, so that now everything is seen in terms of race and racism. You tell a kid in school that he can't, this is a literal example that came up. School policy is you can't wear hoodies. The kid comes to class with his hood up, with the hoodie, and the teacher tells him, take it down. He calls her a racist. This literally happens now. So how far back have we now set race relations with this particular push? And let's ask another question. If you remove Christianity from the picture, which they're explicitly trying to do, you get rid of Christian morality. What happens when you appeal to someone's conscience and the idea of justice and so on, when you're telling them it's a power game and it's a zero-sum power game, and you've got to give up power? What's going to happen when someone doesn't accept Christian morality and you tell them that? What you're doing is you got a recipe for creating white supremacists.
Yes. Well, sadly, they're getting self-fulfilling prophecy here. That's when you handicap and limit and start arresting pastors and everything else, which are probably the one instrument, that the most powerful instrument, which has cultivated the kind of Christian dispositions to loving their neighbor, no matter who or what they are, rather than competing and being in a divided, conflictual relation. You are doing nothing but setting up a recipe for might makes right. And if they really think, even how powerful they are, the elites and all of their instruments, their nukes, if you will, they don't realize, as Hannah Arendt said, when you don't have masses on your side, you're a sitting duck. And she understood probably totalitarianism as anyone, and that's what again, I don't think people are thinking, but this is again part of my issue is people are not, they don't have the moral frame, other than a kind of relativistic competitivism that almost a tribalism now, And I mean, there's a lot of threads that have led to that. I mean, I think Chris, you've been reading, is it Yenner's book on the family?
Right.
But he's someone who's pointing out on the level of the family just the damage done to the natures and kinds and relations that were givens And once you start breaking those down, you set these conditions up that are horrendous, not just for the survival of the family, but for a civilization and everything else. I think this is similar with what we're dealing with meaning in history. I think what has happened is we have a lot of different threads that are sitting together in a very ill-defined kind of pot, if you will. It's kind of like taking every ingredient in your refrigerator now and just putting it into a bowl and cooking it and seeing what happens. I mean, we have nihilism, we have Hegelianism, we have Marxism, we have all these theories that are variations of it. We have threads of Christianity, eschatology. And so there's no coherence to any of it, but there are assumptions going on. And this is what I was meaning, is that on the one hand, you have this meaning-based history of, like, say, critical theory, that there is some meaning to fighting injustice, which there is, that there is some meaning to kind of getting a hold of those places at which some people have not been considered fully human, which there is. Those are Christian concerns. But then when you make everything that, and then you start to break down all of those other aspects of life that aren't bound up with that, and then, so you have a meaning base here, you have ends, justice, and the like, but you don't have a worldview, first of all, that can underwrite it and support it. But then you have an ahistorical side, or a dehistoricization, as some say, in which you basically say the past is nothing other than just the dominants imposing their interpretation of what's meaningful onto the world. You create a counter history. Now everyone is either forced to accept it and learn from it and adopt it, or they're going to be considered an enemy. I mean, we're dealing with probably some of the worst kinds of polarizations and conflicts you can imagine in a society. But maybe a good way at this point is just to kind of back up. Let's just say, we can. Let me go at this direction maybe for one. I'm going to do it from a national side this time. I'm going to do it from a theological side the next time I deal with it, or Christian view. But what happens when one's fundamental kind of historical story does become something that now is just one among other equal variants? And of course, the one that has kind of been the main story, say, of the U.S. and its interpretation of things, now is considered basically oppressive and nothing else. So when multiculturalism happens, and one particular culture happened to dominate the framing of the national story, what then begins to happen when that is taboo, and now you have a floor for competing narratives to take its place? What happens to a nation then, a national identity, people in a nation? I mean, I don't see a lot more than balkanization or tribalism, if that's allowed to keep going.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think what happens, because I've witnessed this sort of thing firsthand, having been involved with these matters in the past, is there's a new veil that goes up, and so what'll happen, or what has happened, and I think is happening now, is you've got this sort of cacophony, and then you've got somebody who becomes the person who adjudicates. Now, when you become the adjudicator, guess what you do? You become the guy who writes the new story. So there are, politicos, there are academics, there are whatever. So there are these people who are taking advantage of this sort of chaos and are pursuing agenda that they're not very sort of transparent about. And if you begin to look behind the curtain, remember that from the Wizard of Oz. Don't ignore the man behind the curtain. When you start to pull that curtain back a little bit and you see who's pulling strings, well, that's when this kind of finger of accusation gets directed at you for doing that, and you're accused of being a racist or whatever the thing happens to be today that we're willing to guillotine somebody over. but there is someone or people or whatever who benefit and who become kind of the people who sort of shepherd things along in a particular direction. And anyway, and they're really good at keeping themselves behind the curtain.
There's an interesting thing that I read today. It was a review, or an interview with someone whose book is coming out in August, I guess. It's a sort of insider critique of woke capitalism.
Okay.
And what he pointed out is that the people at the top in these companies really aren't that concerned, for the most part, about wokeness.
Yes.
They actually hold the woke in contempt and vice versa. But what you have is a marriage of convenience. So, for example, big pharmaceutical companies come in, they're criticized first for raising drug prices.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of pressure put on them not to do that. Then they go woke and start promoting social justice and quietly raise their prices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And nobody complains about it because they're on the right side.
That's right.
The
NFL,
they
fund it too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So they pay their bribes to the group by funding these various things, and that shuts off all criticism of them.
Yeah.
Or think about the NFL. Okay. What was going on before they decided to go woke? There was all of this stuff about concussions and parents who were saying, I'm not going to let my kids play football. And all kinds of stuff like that was going on. Then suddenly Colin Kaepernick comes along and they quickly jump on this, the woke bandwagon, while never rehiring Colin, by the way. They quickly jump on the woke bandwagon, and suddenly you're not hearing discussions of concussions. You're not hearing parents saying, I'm not going to let my kids play football because I don't want them to have brain damage.
Yeah, there are.
That's not an example they use, the article used, but you can see it there too. The guy's got several examples of them, and he started a multi-billion-dollar company, so he knows what he's talking about. This is sort of his circle.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find just exasperating about so many of these young wokies is just where their suspicions stop. They're not suspicious enough. They don't dig deep enough. They don't call for the people that they idolize to put their full cards on the table. They're willing to stop at a certain point and live. Well, we saw this with the Me Too stuff. So much of the Me Too stuff helped to bring to the surface just how sort of compromised liberal politicians, male politicians, have been when it's come to their own sexual dalliances. They're basically taking advantage of women who are in their employ or want to get ahead or whatever. The old casting couch thing applied to politics or whatever.
Yeah.
So then it's sort of like finally there's a kind of like an avalanche of things, and now all of a sudden it stopped again. Have you noticed that? It stopped with Cuomo. Cuomo was sort of like the place where this has gone far enough. We can't lose him.
It actually started earlier than that with Tara Reid and Biden.
Mm. Yeah.
Or looking at Kamala Harris's background and how she rose to prominence.
Right. Yeah. It was okay to go after Bill Clinton after he had been out of office for 20 years. But the guys who are still in right now that everybody still kind of need things from, they're okay. They get a pass.
Mm-hmm.
Well, interestingly connected to this are two things. One is the way in which, surprisingly, the elite and powerful and those that actually could do things to actually help the lives of people, especially those marginalized, by investing maximal amounts of resource, a whole host of things. And the way in which they create a straw man, middle-class Joe the plumber, somehow white supremacist, because he wants to feed his family and he cares about ethics that actually foster human flourishing. Somehow he is the most powerful oppressor of all these people, just because he votes for other people who actually want to be self-determined rather than defined and determined by by these other forces, and yet you have people who actually are in positions of power who have been for ages able to do something, and just because they get the ideology claim right, they confess the right creed, all of a sudden they're off the hook and they're an ally and they're not going. All of a sudden, Occupy Wall Street. Wall Street's now their best friend. And so there is this kind of when you see this kind of wedding between which tries to. Of course, Marx would have a fit with this whole thing.
but we can all remember this stuff from the locker room. When you're in high school and you got you're there in the locker room and guys are just kind of saying exactly what's on their minds. You get guys who are the most popular guy in school, or everybody thinks is a great guy or whatever, and better. You know this guy better than the girls know him. You know this guy better than the teachers know him. You know this guy, and he's absolutely worthless scum. But he's the golden boy, and he knows it, and he's working the system in his favor or to his advantage, and people just kind of it, and so. Anyway, I think people know where I'm going with this. We've already spent a little bit of time with it. By the way, on this note, we probably ought to start bringing this plane in for a landing.
And it definitely did go into places like all our shows and that I didn't imagine, but that's okay. I'm going to revisit the topic. I mean, one of the things, that last point is the way that I think the last glue, if there is any, that is preventing, I think, balkanization and tribalism, it's consumerism, which is not a good thing. And that's a very frail thing. But I think where I wanted to go with all of this was this notion that I do think our religious identities now are basically consumer constructed. And it's something I'm going to get to in some of the later episodes, because I'm really after the pliability of evangelical identity, the way in which the understanding of meaning in history, even when we hold to redemptive history, has kind of taken a back seat to our consumer conception, or our choice conception of ourselves and our identities. And then this is played largely into its pliability and attraction to these alternative ideologies, because we've lost connection to the actual meaning world that Christianity unleashed and gave us.
Well, with that thought, we should, make final statements or final observations. Anything you want to say, Glenn, as we wrap up?
I guess returning to the concept of cyclical history, history doesn't repeat itself. Historians repeat each other. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, so we've had the insider here the whole time, the historian Glenn Sunshine.
That's right.
Thinking
Holding
about
back.
this. That's right. Well, I have a history of not holding back, so I will hold back at this point. So I'm all done. Anything you want to say as we conclude there, Tom?
No, just kind of wrapping up, as some of our audience like us to do, is I'm really just kind of stepping into meaning in history and the way in which history has some kind of movement towards some fulfillment, but also everything matters, if anything matters at all, if you will. But how it matters is, and how we evaluate that is what's significant. We tend to take something that's a relative good and make it an absolute good, and we do a lot of damage. And that old problem of idolatry continues to show itself, as in these contemporary movements that try to get justice. And look, we're all for justice. We want everyone to flourish in the fullness of their created giftedness for the glory of God. But we don't want to do that in a way that we end up unleashing forces that are only going to do damnable things. And I think I'll end it with that.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, folks, for listening to another episode of the Theology Pugcast all the way to the end. We give you a thumbs up and a star for your head. But if you would like to give us a star, if you want to, rate the podcast, and
we'd prefer if you gave us more than one.
That's right. Yeah. If you can give us 5, that'd be great. And, we are on iTunes, and we're on Spotify, and we're on all these different places and sites. We're with the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. By the way, we need to say thank you to the folks who give it to us through the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, and we're very grateful for that. Anyway, with all those things in mind, thank you for your support, and thank you for listening to the show, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.